Alrighty, so 9:03, we can go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending. My name is Brittany Schappach. I'm an entomologist with the Maine Forest Service. We have a really cool workshop for you today. Some awesome guest speakers. All happy to be here. So today's workshop is really going to be focused on forest tent caterpillar for educators and sugary bush operators. So we are going to get pretty specific in that we aren't really going to be talking about forest tent in an aspen or a poplar stand. It's really just going to be forest tent in sugar maple trees. That being said, if we can, I'd like to just have all of the presenters introduce themselves, just your name, what you do, and then I'm not going to do a fun fact or anything like that. Just that we have that, and then we'll just go ahead and follow the agenda. So first on my screen, I have Josh Hellman.
Thanks, Brittany. Yeah, I'm Josh Hellman. I'm the Forest Health Program Manager for the state of Vermont, the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And I'll be talking about what we've experienced with FTC recently.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Next, I have Kyle Lombard.
Good morning, everybody. Kyle Lombard, Forest Health Program in New Hampshire. And I'm hearing a pretty good echo. I don't know if anybody else is hearing that.
Okay, I am hearing that on my side too. So I'm not sure if it's my computer or if it's my owl that I have in the room, but I am hearing that. And I think everyone who's not a presenter can't unmute themselves, it looks like maybe. So we'll work on trying to figure that one out. Sorry about that.
Wow.
And we have Jason Lilly. Who may or may not be able to unmute.
I can unmute other people.
Yeah, would you be able to unmute Jason Lilly? It looks like he is not as a presenter as he should be.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Hey everyone. Yeah, I
Thanks,
also
Dave.
don't have the. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. I also don't have the ability to chat or Q&A. Just put that out there.
Okay.
We'll change that too.
We can. Yeah, we can give you permissions. Sorry about that.
That's okay. All right. Hi everyone. Let me see. There's my video too. I'm Jason Lilly. I'm from Maine Cooperative Extension. And one of my roles with Extension is doing direct outreach to the maple industry across the state.
Okay, thanks, Jason. And last we have Gabe LeMay.
No. Hi, I'll stand up here.
Also presenting.
I'm in person as well. My name is Gabe LeMay. I'm an entomologist, also based out of Old Town with the Maine Forest Service, and I work on forest tent caterpillar fairly frequently. So I'll be giving a little bit of half the presentation that Brittany will start with. Thank you.
So we will just go ahead and get started here. So first things first, get my slides all set. So again, this is going to be pretty specific to forest tent caterpillars in a sugar bush. So I apologize if you already know this information or if you're looking for a little bit more of a broader topic, but it is going to be pretty niche today. So what I'd like to do is just have a nice overview of forest tent caterpillar in general. And what's important to note here is that it is native. And when we're talking about native caterpillars, essentially it means that they're not invasive. So they grew up in this area with the trees that we have here. And that's really important because it means that we have our native predators and other things to really keep it in check most times. That being said, we still have outbreaks, as you may know. They're known to defoliate maple, aspen, or humane folks like to call them poplar trees, oak, and birch. And again, those outbreaks do happen every once in a while. From what we know, it looks like they happen every 10 to 15 years, and they last from anywhere from 2 years to about 4, give or take. And so the issue here is not necessarily that these guys are going to lead to tree death itself. If you have a really well-maintained forest and your trees aren't suffering from drought or other bugs that are killing it, it can lead to tree dieback, but these guys are not necessarily going to kill the tree. That said, they can completely defoliate the tree, which is very stressful. So if you do have background things like drought or bark borers or things like that, it can be the final nail in the coffin to kill a tree. So a little bit about the life cycle for forest tent before we get into the nitty gritty in a few slides here. What you're wanting to be looking for are the egg masses, and that is happening right around October through April. So forest tent caterpillars overwinter inside of the egg mass. So they don't overwinter as caterpillars or moths or in the soil. They actually make these, they're about pea-sized or maybe the size of your pinky tip on the actual twig of their host trees. So very, very tricky to spot. They are going to stay on this twig. They're typically toward the end of the branch. They like to choose the newer roots, the newer shoots rather, of these trees. Very hard to see, but we'll go over that in a little bit. So after they are on those twigs in that egg mass, they overwinter, and then what happens is that they start to emerge. So we have an early emergence in the left picture here and with the red background. These are very, very small caterpillars. This happens about April, right around the same time that the buds start to break on their host trees. And as you can imagine, they start pretty small, but they will continue to grow. And when they are growing, they're eating a lot of leaves. You're going to see a lot more defoliation through April, May, and then they reach full size right about June. And so in June time is when you can actually identify the caterpillar quite easily from their definite characteristics here. So you're looking for darker in color. They have a blue stripe down their back, and we call them like foothole prints. It almost looks like a shoe print in that white color down their back, or a keyhole is what it looks like. They are hairy, so some people might have some irritation toward their hairs, so I wouldn't recommend handling them, but they're not toxic in the same way that something like brown tail moth caterpillars are. And once they are full size in June, they can wreak some havoc. This photo here is from Blue Hill, June 2018. And so you can see it's completely denuded. It looks really detrimental. It looks like maybe this could have been taken in the middle of winter, for all you know. And it's not. It's actually in June. So you can imagine this is a pretty stressful event for these trees. And again, as long as these trees are healthy, which, you know, by the side of the road, it's always a bet. These trees will bounce back for the most part. They'll flesh out those leaves before the end of the summer, and that's really important because they need their leaves to process that energy and then survive the winter. So again, it looks really scary. As long as the trees are healthy, they can usually grow those leaves back. But if they're not healthy, this really is a stressful event for them. They might not have the resources to survive over the winter or flesh out new leaves. So after that, we've got July. And so you can imagine they're a caterpillar, they're going to undergo metamorphosis. So they'll have a cocoon, which can be seen here on the left. They essentially, as a caterpillar, they just wrap a whole bunch of silk around themselves and they undergo bodily changes into when they become a moth. So we do have sexually dimorphic. They're a little bit different looking here, but for the most part, we don't necessarily care about the moths. The moths aren't the ones that are going to be defoliating the trees very much here. But we also don't want to be inviting the moths around. So if you do have like floodlights or any kind of outdoor lights, things like that on your sugar bush, these can be attractive to moths. And so you might be really inviting them to your property to be able to mate and then lay these eggs, and then you'll have populations just continue on the next year. That being said, we already know sort of what this is. This is an egg mass, so that's what the moths are going to be laying. These are really cool because they are wrapped in this substance called spumoline, which is a very, very sticky substance. So these are really hard to take off of the twig. This isn't something that you can just scrape away. They harden on there like cement. And the spumoline really helps them stick on there, and it also helps protect the eggs that are going to undergo overwinter. So if you're thinking, well, maybe Maine winters are really harsh, might kill the forest tent caterpillar populations in these eggs, that's unfortunately not really the case. Again, they're native, they grew up here, so they're very much used to our Maine winters. So that being said, there are still things that will kill forest tent caterpillars. One of these is environmental. Now, I just said that the really cold winters, while their eggs won't kill the eggs inside. But if they hatch from these eggs and they're very small caterpillars, that is the most vulnerable state that these guys can be in. So when you're a caterpillar, you don't really have the same protections as you do when you're in an egg mass covered in that spumoline. So a late freeze in spring, something like that, after the caterpillars have emerged already, can be really detrimental to your life as a caterpillar. We also have things like competition. So if you remember a few slides ago, I had that photo of Blue Hill where all of those trees are completely denuded. And that's really hard if you're a caterpillar and you're looking for food and there's no food left. That means you're going to have to wander maybe across a road, maybe into a different area. And so you're taking a lot of energy to go and try to find new food sources. So that could also lead to death. You might be eaten by a predator on your way there. You might be run over by a car on your way there. So if that's not going to get you, it'll be predators or parasites. And so things like birds and frogs and mice and skunks and a bunch of other things, again, they're native. So all of these creatures grew up together. And so they know exactly what they can and can't eat. And so we can see here, these are some stink bugs that are eating one of the forest tent caterpillars. We also have this thing called a friendly fly, and they really show up in high populations of forest tent caterpillars. Now, it's not usually what happens right away. Typically, it takes a few years for these guys to really catch up and notice the increase in the forest tent caterpillar populations. So you'll typically see the peak of the friendly flies show up in June, and then in July, they're all gone. And if we think about the life cycle, that's because the moths are out and they're no longer caterpillars. And so with these guys, they have maggots that actually bore into those developing cocoons. You can see here on the left, that's what that fly is doing. And as you can imagine, as a caterpillar, that's not so fun. That will kill the caterpillar. And these flies can disrupt caterpillar populations, but what I said before is quite true here. So it takes a little bit for them to really start to knock that population down. So the first year there's a really high outbreak, there might be some flies in that area. Those flies will successfully lay their maggots inside of these cocoons, kill. And then the next year, those maggots do quite well. They survive. That cycle continues. Then there's more. Because if you're thinking about the population, how it's increasing for the forest tent, that's a lot of food. That's a lot of prey available for these flies. So that process will continue until eventually these flies really can take over the caterpillars and knock them down. We get calls sometimes that these flies are quite a nuisance, but they're non-biting flies. The worst thing that they do is land on your skin, and then maybe they're a little bit annoying, but they're friendly. We like them. But that being said, it does take them a little bit to try to knock those populations down. So we do have some really high years of defoliation potential. The other thing that can happen here is a natural control. This is nuclear polyhedrosis virus. We just call it NPV because that's a mouthful. And essentially what happens here is this virus gets into the caterpillar and bursts its guts from the inside. So oftentimes you'll see them hanging in this V shape. And that's essentially because their guts just acted as a glue, and then the rest of their bodies hang when they die. And what's cool about this, not cool for the caterpillars, cool for us, is because these caterpillars are typically feeding together, they move together in these hordes. If one of them has the virus and then their guts explodes and they're walking all over each other, they're near each other, that virus can spread in that population and then knocks them down. There's also fungus that can do this too, same type of idea here. If one caterpillar dies, these usually fungal spores that will spread around to other caterpillars and kill them as well. So lots of different things to try to keep them from becoming in an outbreak situation, but these things take time. It'll happen eventually, but sometimes if the trees are unhealthy and you've got these crazy high numbers of defoliation, it can be challenging for the tree. Another thing I want to mention here is populations are cyclical. And so this is an outbreak that happened in Maine in the early 80s. And so we start pretty small. 1980, we have an estimate of about 30,000 defoliation of acres. And that's because we didn't actually get a final count there. So that one might be a little undershooting it, because in 1981, you're seeing that we're almost we're at 457,000 acres defoliated. 1982 was a huge one. We've got about 500,000 to 750,000, which is an insane amount. Important to note here, though, this population up here in the 1979 to 1981 happened in Aroostook County. This was primarily an aspen stand. But in 1982, that population started to collapse because it had been a couple of years. And we actually started to see different populations in Washington County, some areas in Penobscot County, and Somerset County, Somerset being mostly sugar maples. Those populations really started to grow. So we had a lot of forest tent caterpillars in those areas, while the Aroostook caterpillar population really started to collapse. So if these were both active at the same time, we really could have had a lot more numbers here, but that's sort of what's going on. So populations were collapsing in Aroostook while they were growing in some of the other areas. If you could see here, by 1984, gone, absolutely nothing. Absolutely not a single acreage of damage was picked up from our aerial survey. So populations are cyclical. We have seen outbreaks in Maine, but for the most part, they don't tend to last more than 4 years, although when they are occurring, they can be pretty detrimental.
All right, I'll take over from here. This is some data from our light trap program. We've been running this program for decades and decades now, so we have some really good data on a lot of adult moth flight data. So as you can see, in the early 80s, we did see a large number of adult moths collected in our traps. And then since then, we've actually seen this. We've seen minor outbreaks every 10 to 15 years. Generally, at each of these spikes here, we see less than 1,000 acres of damage mapped by our aerial survey. And again, if you look at the tail end over here, we are seeing a slight increase in adult captures of forest tent caterpillar, but nowhere near what we saw in the 1980s. We did just get our data from 2024, so we'll hopefully be processing that soon, and we'll see if we see an even larger increase from there, but that will be posted soon. So I'm just going to walk through the recent outbreak in Maine over the past couple of years. 2021 was fairly quiet. We did see a little bit of forest tent caterpillar defoliation in Fort Kent. That was just over 200 acres. However, this really took off in 2022. So this is what we consider the start of this outbreak. We saw damage spanning from Fort Kent all the way into Caribou, and we logged about almost 17,000 acres from our aerial survey, or actually from our ground survey. Our aerial survey wasn't as comprehensive that year just because pretty poor conditions for flying. The good news is that all this rain that occurred that year actually helped the aspen refoliate and bounce back from the defoliation a little easier. Last year, 2023, we saw an increase in total defoliation, almost doubling to 30,500 acres. Again, this was largely in the county from Fort Kent down into Caribou and spanning across the border. However, in 2024, this is the third consecutive year now that we've seen damage in Aroostook County. This is still nowhere near the 500,000 acres that we would see the early 80s during that outbreak. The host species is primarily aspen, as Brittany mentioned. Here's a picture that I believe Mike Bricio took on one of his recent flights in the county. And the good news is that fortunately the aspen does seem to be recovering fairly well. However, this is kind of the reason that we're here today. We did this year see a lot of defoliation by the Quebec border in Big Six Township. So this year we logged 3,385 acres of damage, primarily in Big Six Township. Here are our aerial survey polygons. We essentially go up in a plane. We have a little tablet where we draw the damage that we're observing. This is a picture of some defoliation that Mike saw. These now live on our website, so you can access these by the link below if you'd like to view them. And our observations and the observations of foresters, people moving across the border, do indicate that this defoliation is contiguous with a infestation just across the border in St. Orly and beyond. This data is from the Quebec Forest Service. And as you can see, they're seeing more or less the same trends that we are. Fairly quiet in 2021. 2022 is when it first starts up around northern Aroostook County. 2023, again, more of the same. You can see down here, they did see a little blip closer to the Big Six area, but we'll have to wait and see what their numbers are for 2024 as well. So I wanted to kind of move into some satellite imagery because this is a really good tool that I think people should be aware of. This is Big Six Township. Over there is Quebec and the border. And as you can see, this is around early May. So all these kind of brown spots are primarily sugar maple. They have not foliated yet. But if we go forward a month to June 2nd, you can see everything's green, leaf out, nothing to be the problem. However, if we go another month in the future, you can start to see these bald spots. And these are the defoliation that we observed from the air. This was on June 25th. And as you can see, these are our aerial survey polygons. They don't match up perfectly just because sometimes it's kind of hard to get that polygon perfect on the tablet. But more or less pretty consistent in terms of acreage. We saw around just over 3,000, as I said before, and they are a little bit off skew, so you can't go primarily off just the aerial survey polygons, but we're pretty happy with this. You go into July 27th, another month later, as you can see, the sugar maple is actually refoliated. So these portions in the sugar bush look a little bit different, especially if you go all the way to August 29th. As you can see, the refoliated portions have remained green, while most of the unaffected sugar maples have started to turn color already. And this is the case still on the ground. I believe I was checking the other day, in October, a lot of these refoliated portions still had green leaves, while most of the other ones were bare, interestingly enough. And you can view this data yourself. There are a couple different web apps that are available to people to use. One of them is sentinel2explorer.esri.com. This is the same producers of ArcPro. Thank you to Huber's Lance Case for pointing this out. This does require an AGOL account if you have one. This is a really good option. There's also eos.com/land viewer. This has a daily image limit, so you can look at a certain number of satellite photographs per day, but it's more or less functionally identical to the Sentinel-2 Explorer. Okay, I kind of want to shift because I feel like there has been a lot of talk about aerial spraying, and if this is a strategy that people want to pursue for forest tent caterpillar management. This is information that you might like to know if you are implementing a spray program. This is not an endorsement of a spray program. This is just some contextualization. So if you are spraying, the active ingredient that you'll be applying will be Bacillus thuringiensis, subspecies Kerstaki, also known as BTK. This is an ingestible larvicide. This is not a contact insecticide, so the larvae actually has to eat this product. And it gets spread on the canopy via these small little droplets. And so ideally, every single individual one of these droplets will be a lethal dose. So they only have to eat one drop. In that sense, droplet sizing is kind of important, but I'll touch upon that in a bit. In terms of spray timing, this is best applied right as the larvae begin to emerge in spring. So this will be late April, more or less into May. And it's important to actually examine the ground level egg masses to see when these caterpillars are emerging. You do want to wait for, all the caterpillars do emerge before you apply. But you don't want to wait so long that all the larvae are kind of large and a little bit more resistant, and they'll have eaten plenty of foliage already. The leaves also must be expanded to catch the droplets, so it has to be something for the droplet to actually cling to. And the other thing to note is that BTK is relatively short-lived in the environment, depending on what product you buy. But it's really only good for about 3 to 5 days once you apply it. After that, it loses its potency. Some other considerations: weather. If you've never done an aerial spray before, no wind is actually bad, because no wind at all results in a lot of drift, just because there's no wind to actually push the product down onto the canopy, which is what you want. So you want low, steady wind, not high, fairly consistent. Also, do not apply if rain is predicted within 6 hours. BTK needs a curing period. So basically, once those droplets hit the leaves, they have to dry and it cure. If they're still wet and it rains later, that'll just get washed right off. BTK, depending on the product that you use, 4A-48B is one of them. It does have a relatively short shelf life. You can't just stockpile this kind of thing. So in the example here, this loses about 10% potency every year. So you should ideally use it the year that you buy it. Some spray terminology. This is a little bit technical. You might not need this. But the difference between calibration and characterization is something that you might hear from spray applicators. Calibration involves the quantity and the flow rate of the product that you're using. Think about like you're adjusting a nozzle. The characterization is the actual quality of the droplets themselves. So you want, say, a droplet this size, and you want this this weight, that kind of thing. There's also effective swath versus total swath. Effective swath is the area where you intend the amount of spray to be deposited. So you can think about wingtip to wingtip. Total swath is a little more technical. This is the decreased amount at the areas of the edge of the effective swath. So as you can imagine, when you're flying, you're going to be zigzagging over an area. You want some amount of overlap so that the total amount is consistent across the entire forest. Another consideration to make is whether you want to go with a fixed wing aircraft or a rotary aircraft. Fixed wing are typically faster, they're less expensive, and they are also less maneuverable because they're not a helicopter, obviously. This is typically what's most common. Rotary aircraft are being used. They are a bit more expensive, but they're better for these irregular areas. So they're more maneuverable. They also have a smaller spray tank, so they might need to refill more often. Something to consider. There are a couple licensed applicators who can apply in Maine. There's JBI, which is based out of New Hampshire, and MG Carmichael, which is based out of Prescott, Maine. Just some names for you to be aware. The spray operator will require shape files. They need to know where to apply, essentially. So they might also require no fly zone areas, no spray zone, any time restrictions. These are more important in urban areas where you want to, like, say, avoid a school when kids are being let out. This shouldn't be a problem in the Big Six area just because there's mostly just trees around there. Your spray operator can provide a log file which shows their travel route and the areas where they did apply pesticide. One thing I want to make very clear here is that our aerial survey polygons are not to be intended for management purposes. Don't just provide those polygons to the spray applicator. That won't result in a good outcome. As you can see, they were sometimes offset, and that's not the intended use of that data. But some things to consider for your aerial survey polygons if you want to make those yourself. You want to think about total application cost. You can't just spray everything. That would be cost prohibitive. You want to be more targeted. The ease of application, how those polygons are actually shaped, because certain shapes are easier for a zigzagging, kind of snaking aircraft to apply easier. And then lastly, obviously, the expected defoliation that you would see in that stand. And that's mostly based off of the forest tent caterpillar egg mass survey, which is, I'm sure, what most people are here for today. So we will be covering this tomorrow in much more in depth on the ground in Big Six, but I just wanted to give some basic information about the protocol that we'll be using. So an egg mass survey, this the number of forest tent caterpillar egg masses observed during the winter when leaves are off is indicative of the likelihood of noticeable defoliation that will occur next season. And so this involves inspecting a certain number of branches per tree, a certain number of trees per plot, and then a certain number of plots per, say, Sugarbush or overall area that you're interested in. Once you have that number from that little formula, you consult a reference table, and the reference table will match your collected value with a degree of defoliation, or say high or low defoliation. And so there are a couple different methods that you can use. These are the standard ones that are used from what we found. There's a great protocol out of New York. There's one out of Vermont, and then there's one developed by Alberta, mostly for aspen, but Quebec uses that as well. So I actually sent these links to Amy, and she can drop them in the chat.
She did.
She did? Okay, cool. So click on those if you're interested. We'll bring out printouts tomorrow for the actual workshop, so don't worry about bringing that down. Surveying a plot. So here's the basic gist of it. You approach a dominant or codominant tree, a sugar maple. You're going to focus your binoculars and your sighting scope on the upper third of that crown, and then you're going to select an individual branch tip and look for any egg masses 30 inches inward from that tip, counting all the ones that you see. You're going to repeat this for 10 number of branches. It might be a little bit less depending on what protocol you're using, but you're going to count those, and your partner can record the data, or you can record it yourself. Once you're done with a tree, then you walk 100 feet away, and you do that with the second tree, and so on. One important thing here is that we only want to count the new egg masses. As you can see, there's two pictures right here. They can be kind of difficult to distinguish when you're on the ground, you're looking through binoculars. But you want to look for the ones that still have that spumoline, is that the word?
Spumoline.
Spumoline, sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brett. That still have that outer kind of glossy covering. These will be darker and a little shiny. Here's an old one. As you can see, it's full of these holes and it no longer has that outer covering. This is a egg mass that has already emerged and they will stick around for multiple seasons. So they will start to accumulate and you're really not interested in those if you're looking at egg masses for the intention of what the next following season will be. Vermont has a fun trick. If you don't want to distinguish between new and old egg masses in the canopy, you can actually just find some that are on the ground level at lower branches where they're much easier to distinguish between. And you just get a good ratio of new to old, and then you can multiply that by what you see in the canopy and just make that assumption. Some other tips, you want to have a good distribution of trees within a plot. Vermont recommends multiple elevations because a lot of these sugar bushes are built or on a hill. So you want to get trees that are towards the crest and some that are towards the bottom. New York also has a random ordination chart. Essentially here you just go east, west, north, or south, depending on what the chart indicates. It's supposed to be completely random so that you have an unbiased sample of trees. You also want to avoid any edge effects by moving at least 100 feet into a stand. As you can see by the satellite imagery, there were those defoliation pockets, but they didn't expand all the way to the very edge of those sugar bush plantations. So there might be less egg masses towards the edge of the stand, so you want to avoid that. So here's an example. This is the very edge of Big 6, and here's a sugar bush. So this is around 500 acres. And so say you wanted to survey this plot, or this sugar bush. So for each sugar bush, you're going to want to establish a plot to start. Put this right in the middle. For each plot, it's going to be anywhere from 2 to 25 trees. Recommend around 10 trees. But how many plots should you do? So here's the New York protocol. This was intended for much smaller sugar bushes, as you can tell. So we have 500 acres, and we're way off the limit of this chart right here. So if you were following this guidance, you would do 10 different plots within one sugar bush. That might be a little bit labor intensive, so we don't really recommend that, especially if you have multiple sugar bushes. So here's another scenario. You could start with one plot per sugar bush and incorporate more as you have resources to. But it's more important to kind of start out slow and get some data with the resources that you have first. And so here's where we'll actually be meeting for our demonstration tomorrow, right around here at the edge of this sugar bush. Coordinates are in the agenda. If you have any trouble, we can talk about getting to the location, but we'll be meeting there. We'll be identifying egg masses. We'll be practicing spotting using binoculars and spotting scopes. We'll be comparing 2 different protocols, and we'll be having a general discussion with people who are more experienced with this, who kind of point us in the right direction. So with that, how are we doing on time?
9:36.
9:36. What
Yeah.
time is our next presenter?
9:45. We do have a question in the chat.
Okay.
If you are interested in answering.
Sure.
So Jason asked, is the Big 6 outbreak considered a new outbreak, i.e. year 1, or a continuation of the Aroostook outbreak? Meaning, do we expect this to be ramping up or winding down?
Time will tell. This is the first year that it's come on our radar. Some foresters in the area might have noticed some previous year, but we didn't actually fly that area, so we don't know how many acres are defoliated if there were forest tent caterpillar in the area. Whether or not it's in sync with the northern infestation, time will tell. We don't know. Typically, these are coordinated with one another, if it's just spilling over down south, or if it's a separate population. But that's one of the reasons that we kind of want people to be aware, and that we'll be surveying that area in following years. Any other questions we got in the chat?
Yes, another one from Jason. What is the quantity of the water/carrier needed per acre for spray applications? Any estimates of cost per acre?
Cost per acre, I couldn't tell you. I think it varies by state and product and supplier and applicator. The 4A, 48B, I don't believe is diluted at all. I think it just gets loaded straight in. But I'm not an expert on that. I would consult your applicator. They'll know all the details.
Okay, we have another question here from Christopher. You mentioned at the beginning that forest tent caterpillar does not generally kill trees in well-managed forests. Given sugaring's effect in reducing sugar maple growth rate, can you quantify the additional mortality, if any, on tapped sugar maple?
You know, there's really not enough research for tent caterpillar in relation to sugar maples. I think Quebec is working on a research group, which is kind of exploring this a little bit further, but I don't know, some other experts might have better idea than I do.
I'll share a little data on that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason.
Okay, so stay tuned. Let's see. I think that's all the questions we've got in the chat for right now. So I'm happy to go ahead and move forward if folks are all set. Jason, do you have sharing capabilities? Were we able to get you set? Oh, good. Okay, I can see you. Hopefully you can share your screen. We can just move right on along here. So again, we've got Jason Lilly. He's going to be presenting on the impacts of defoliation. I will lead you the floor. Hopefully you can share. The mic is yours.
Okay, I actually might need privileges for sharing.
Okay.
I will work on that. I think I set you up as a presenter, so you should be okay. But if you don't see a share button,
I see the share button, but it's grayed out.
okay.
I think we can manually allow you to share your screen though. I think I might have just changed your role.
Gotcha. Yep, I see it now.
So you should be able to share.
See. Can you see that full screen?
Oh, we
Yes.
can.
Okay.
Excellent.
Well, thanks for the invite and thanks to the Forest Service's efforts in pulling people together to discuss this topic. And I know it's a big source of concern and stress for folks up in the Big Six area, and that's definitely understandable. You know, this is not a new issue and concern. You know, Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire went through this just about 8 years ago or so, and as Brittany said, that this is a native species, so our maple trees are used to dealing with these sorts of setbacks, these defoliation events, and extreme weather events, all these types of things. The sugar maple is well adapted to have some insurance policies and be able to withstand these things, but it still is a concern, and it still is something that I'll talk about some of the ways that previous outbreaks have led to some detrimental effects for sugar makers. Just a quick background for myself. I'm again with Maine Cooperative Extension. Part of my role is working with the maple industry across the state. I am just coming off of 6 days of maple programming where the Maine Maple Producers Association and myself organized the North American Maple Syrup Conference. That was in Portland over the past week. And with that, we had specialists in, folks who work with maple, maple production in general, but also foresters with background and experience with sugar maples. So it was a great opportunity over the past week for me to kind of pick the brains of those specialists and to get more data on what we might be gearing up for here in Maine. Okay, so we're gonna talk a little bit about, just trying to wrap our heads around the extent of the outbreak and the issue. I'm going to talk and share a little bit of data related to tree growth rate, related to forest tent caterpillars, the potential for tree mortality related to these outbreaks, Unfortunately not give any solid answers, but to provide a little bit of background with the data that we do have related to sap yields and sap quality as affected by the forest tent outbreak. Give just a few kind of tips thinking more long-term related to sugarbush management for resilience against setbacks like this one. So what are the effects of defoliation on tree health? And as with everything in the forestry and most of agriculture, it really depends. So when we're thinking of how hard hit the trees are going to be, it really depends on the extent of defoliation each year. There have been reports in other outbreaks and other locations of the caterpillars actually defoliating so hard so early that the second flush of leaves is actually again defoliated. So if you lose two batches of leaves, and you're obviously the trees are burning through much more carbohydrates and energy reserve, and that's going to set those trees back much further. And not only are they burning through those energy reserves to put out that second flush of leaves, but they also don't have those solar panels there to go through the photosynthesis process and to create more reserves. The duration of the outbreak, a single season of defoliation, trees are well adapted to withstand that. Unfortunately, if we get into our 2, 3, 4 years of defoliation, that's obviously draining much more of the reserves of those trees. A really central component to this, and something that myself and a lot of my colleagues are having a lot of discussions around, is how can we as sugar makers and land managers enhance the health and vitality of the sugar bush, thinking long term. So there's some research out there showing that liming and spreading lime, it's not fertilizer, but and increasing the pH of the soils can actually increase the growth rate and the health of the trees. Thinking about where we're putting roads and reducing compaction and reducing root shear and damage to the roots. Thinking about water diversion and how can we, better brace the sugar bush for withstanding these 3-4 inch rainfalls in a day and extended periods of drought at the same time. So those are things that we need to keep in mind, and in relation to this specific outbreak, thinking are areas of the sugar bush on really thin ledgy outcroppings where there's not a lot of soil health there. Were they struggling to begin with? Or some of them, have they been damaged by thinning operations? Are they really high elevation where they're more prone to struggle? So thinking about those areas and maybe prioritizing those for management if you decide to go that way. And lastly, we've got climatic conditions prior to and following the outbreaks. And I know that, in 22 and 21, that there were some pretty significant drought conditions that were present up there that are also kind of adding to my level of concern with this defoliation. So just thinking about reduction in growth of the trees, these data has shown that when we have these defoliation events, we can have up to a 50% reduction in tree growth. And that growth can continue on, or that reduction in growth, for 1 to 3 years after the defoliation events. So this can all have pretty kind of longer term negative consequences. The reasoning behind this, or what's actually going on, is that the leaves are there photosynthesizing, pulling in and creating carbohydrates, which are starches and sugars, and the concentration of those starches and sugars gets pulled down into the wood. Some of that goes to structural carbohydrates, so the wood itself, and others go into non-structural carbohydrates such as starches and sugars. So that's essentially what we're tapping into and extracting for our syrup production. It's also what is going towards the development and the growth of the tree itself. So if we have less capture and creation of carbohydrates, we're going to have reduction in that growth rate. And here we can see, on these growth rings, we had 3 pretty solid years, pretty good growth happening there. And then if we jump forward 2 years, some event happened there where it could have been extreme drought, could have been too much water and soil saturation, it could have been defoliation events where those growth rings are much tighter together, so we have much less radial growth happening. So on the tree mortality front, as we're reducing the starch and sugar reserves, we're also obviously just decreasing the health of those trees. So one study that was based on the forest tent caterpillar outbreak that was in Vermont and Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 2016. No, sorry, this goes back to 2006. But they showed that in general, in good years without defoliation events, that the average sugar maple mortality rate is around 0.5 to 1% per year. So that's just natural dieback. After that 2002 to 2007 outbreak, that rate went up to 3 to 4% tree loss per year. And that was primarily, again, in trees that had kind of predisposing conditions. So areas where there was low calcium in the soils, so more acidic soils, where there had been drought conditions after the outbreaks, or some more bony, highly drained soils, where there had been recent crown dieback, maybe an ice storm, or again just issues with the soil conditions and general health, and also trees that were in the mid-story of the canopy versus the dominant tree canopy. So trees that had multiple factors to kind of be struggling, those were the ones that were more predisposed to experience that death. So just to dive into that, like multiple factors happening at the same time a little bit further. This is kind of the layout of what we call the sugar maple decline complex. And this is where you're starting out with these predisposing factors. So it might just be the genetic potential of that tree might be a little bit weaker, or just the trees that that seed came from may have just been the genetics are not there for that to survive for as long. You might have older trees that are already kind of reaching their maturity. Again, you might be on more heavily drained soils or heavier soils, or low fertility soils. And the climate could also be, it might be in a particularly cold pocket, or it might be on a south-facing slope that gets actually too warm of conditions. One more factor to throw in there might be elevation. So if you're up at 3,000-4,000 feet, you're going to have more stress at that level. So we move on from that, and if we end up with these inciting factors like defoliation, root damage, so if you've got access roads and that are too close to the base of the trees, or a drought or flooding events, that's going to just kind of speed up that kind of downward spiral. And then contributing factors or the boring insects or opportunistic pathogens that are kind of like the final nail in the coffin on some of those trees that already, again, had the predisposing factors and went through the inciting factors to further weaken them. So these are all things that we kind of need to keep in mind as we're prioritizing if and where we might actually go through some or maybe think about spraying to reduce further stress on these trees. So here's the slide that no one's going to feel very rewarded by. So on the sap yields, we really don't have any conclusive evidence correlating a defoliation event with immediate sap yield or sweetness. And really, this is a good thing that it's so hard to figure out what's going on here, in that trees have insurance policies. So if you think about kind of the evolution and just the survival of maple trees and trees in the Northeast in general, they really need to be able to withstand these defoliation events or these drought events. If the trees were fully dependent on the starches and sugars from the previous season, and then we have defoliation and there's very little photosynthesis that happens, then those trees aren't going to have the resources to withstand these like hiccups in poor seasons. So with that, there's been research that shows that the actual sugar molecules that we're pulling through our sap lines, those are typically created anywhere from last year, but primarily 3 to 5 years prior, meaning that the trees are storing up and they have a bank that they can rely on in their kind of ray cells. And 1 year of the setback doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to have detriment to the tree, and it also doesn't mean that we're going to see that immediately in the sap yields. So some sugar makers have shared that they have seen decline in yield and sweetness. Others have seen no issue a year after defoliation. So again, it depends. One thing to think about, and I'm going to talk about some kind of past weather, trends or events that we've seen. But it might be worth thinking about reduction in tapping. At the very least, reducing your tapping depth, I think, is going to be one mode to not just pull the taps on a season, because that has huge economic consequences. But tapping less deeply stresses that tree less. It will pull less sap, and it can also reduce the non-conductive wood, kind of the scarring that happens inside the tree. So it's, again, kind of less detriment to the tree in doing that. So there's a tool, it's a Forest Drought Response Index, and this is kind of looking at multiple different factors, including transpiration, how much soil moisture the trees are pulling up, and how much rainfall is being added back to the soils. So it's looking at really total available water to trees in different areas. And, again, looking back 2 full seasons, we know that up in the Big Six area, we had some pretty, here listed as exceptional drought. So the highest on the chart. So there were, in recent history, some really serious stressors on the trees in this area. And then even this year, this is from late July, but in that zone, we have, moderate to, again, that exceptional drought that happened again and kind of persisted through the late season. So, so this is just one more thing to add on to that level of consideration and your calculation of how we're going to move forward with management here. Kind of thinking more generally, and this is not necessarily helpful for this particular outbreak, but thinking long term, it's increasingly important to think about managing for extreme weather and just general enhancing the vitality and the health of the sugarbush. And we know that thinking about forest floor management, how we're going to get more coverage out there for holding moisture, for minimizing that frost, the depth of the frost that's getting into the soils and potentially shearing off feeder roots. Really thinking about road access and water diversion, how we're going to reduce erosion and nutrient loss, and thinking about healthier soils and potentially even fertility applications. So, this isn't something that everyone should just run out and do. But with some thoughtfulness and some soil testing and thinking about logistics, it has been shown that there is the potential, benefit and cost effectiveness to do some lime applications and thinking about soil fertility. Other factors in this realm is thinking about roads and times of year that you're accessing the woods. And again, trying to really reduce that compaction and root shearing. And there are a lot of resources out there to help folks to accomplish these things. So the Natural Resources Conservation Service has a lot of funds right now. And that's one that I've been helping folks to think through, what are some ways that we could enhance the quality of the sugarbush, and to do so by tapping into the cost share programs from the USDA. So happy to help folks think through those types of improvements. There's folks on this call who are much more suited to talk about kind of stocking density and thinning and all those things, but this is just a very general high level way to think about stocking density in relation to sugaring. So if we're understocked, we know we're going to have good diameter growth. We're going to have lots of room for each tree canopy to grow upward and expand. Going to have good basal area regeneration, and less stress and competition among trees. But if we're significantly understocked, we have less tappable stems and therefore lower profitability. We do know that a larger stem tree will give you more sap per year, but that only pays off, to a certain extent. So we don't want to just have 20 trees per acre and call that good, and to go to that extreme with improving the health of the trees. On the other end, if we're overstocked, we have really slow tree growth, a lot of tree decline, and a lot of just competition for resources among that. But we have more tappable trees. So again, we're trying to find this kind of middle ground. 80 to 100 tappable taps per acre is a really solid place to be, where you're kind of hitting all these requirements. Another thing to think about is diversity out in the sugarbush. So this is from my counterpart in Vermont, Mark Islehart. And this was from the 2016 outbreak that they had. That tree that you're seeing in the middle is a sugar maple, and the fully leaved out trees around the edges are red maples. So still tappable, high quality, sap yielding trees, but just going from sugars and leaving a few reds in there is enough diversity to slow down this particular outbreak. You know, I know there aren't a lot of red maples just naturally up in that area, but thinking about like how can we have more understory growth? How can we have more diversity of species so that there's more habitat for beneficial insects and that there's more kind of chopping up the movement of these forest tent caterpillars, so they just can't go from branch to branch and just move around, but they have to expend more energy to get from food source to food source. So that was kind of my quick and dirty of forest tent caterpillar impacts. I know a lot of folks were hoping for me to say, you know, we definitely need to do this or that in order to maintain sap yields, or this is the exact impact it's going to have on sap yields. Unfortunately, it's not that clean and dry, but anyway, at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has them. I'd also just highly recommend that folks check out this resource. This has significant input from folks all across the maple producing region, a lot of specialists, and it has everything from Sugarbush management for preparing and managing Sugarbush for sap collection, right up through to canning and regulations, and it's really a comprehensive guide that anyone that's working with sugar makers or is a sugar maker should have handy.
All right, so thanks for that, Jason. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. That being said, we will have a Q&A session at the end after all the presenters have presented. So if there is folks that still have lingering questions about some of the stuff, we can wait till then. That being said, next on the agenda for today, I've got Josh Hellman. So Josh, if you're around, if you can share your screen, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Brittany. Let's see if I can get this to work. All right, so that's got all the tiles there. And if I maximize it, do you see the whole show there?
Yep, that looks great.
All right, great. Well, thanks very much. Yeah, great presentations to lead off here. I think I might have some duplicate slides of some of these, so we might be able to move fast on this as well. But yeah, thanks for having me today. As I mentioned, I'm the Forest Health Program Manager for the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation here in Vermont. And yeah, you know, in Vermont, sugar maple is our most common species by volume in the state. So we are no stranger to these forest tent caterpillar outbreaks. And in fact, we've been tracking the frequency of this for over 100 years now. And, you know, what we see is kind of what was presented earlier, where we have these periodic outbreaks separated by, you know, somewhere along the lines of 10 years. And the duration of those outbreaks lasting anywhere from kind of 2 to 6 years on average. You know, this is just a graph showing over time when we have those high levels of forest tent caterpillar activity throughout the state. And as was mentioned as well, this is, of course, is a native insect, so we do expect these outbreaks to happen every so often. I want to walk back a little bit. Our most recent outbreak was really from 2016 to 2018. But prior to that, in the mid 2000s, we had an outbreak in the state that was in the southern portion of the state. So you can see the map here showing the first year of defoliation in 2004, kind of in the southwest portion of the state, near Lake Champlain. And as the outbreak progressed, it kind of filled in that southern half of the state. And was quite an issue. About 10% of the Vermont northern hardwood forest type was defoliated during these years. But you can see that despite it being located down in the southern portion of the state, we do have sugar maple throughout Vermont. And so It did not make its way in heavy numbers to the northern part of the state in that outbreak. And it's kind of a trend that we see here when we do get these FTC outbreaks, is that they aren't always in the same place and they kind of move around. And perhaps that's because of different weather conditions leading up to those kind of increases in population for FTC. But whatever the reason, we do see them kind of migrate around. And so we always want to keep our eyes open for where these numbers might be building in any given year. Yeah, this is the composite map, basically, of those 3 years of defoliation from that earlier outbreak. Again, in southern Vermont, and those areas that are, you might be able to make out some of that yellow and red there. Those are the areas that had repeated defoliation as well. So some areas, you may know, might get just 1 year of defoliation during an outbreak. Some areas will, get 2 to 3 years of defoliation. And it's those areas where you have those repeated defoliations that are, of course, of more concern to tree health and to sugar making concerns. If you've been up where the outbreak is going on in Maine, this is probably not a shocking image to you, but if you've never experienced a forest tent caterpillar outbreak on the ground, this was just a roadside image that folks took during our 2016 outbreak, where it was pretty remarkable, where the lower elevations didn't have any defoliation going on, but upper elevations did in the northern part of the state. And similar to what Gabe was showing earlier, you can detect this very easily from aerial surveys. So we fly the state every year looking for any kind of forest damage. And of course, this is imagery from June or July of 2016, showing these patches of forest across the landscape where you normally have a green canopy and it would look totally fine, but completely denuded. And it's pretty easy to map when you see it in this scale. And it's pretty clear what the disturbance is if you have folks on the ground who are dealing with this firsthand. So it's a good tool to have planes in the air to map what's going on so that we can know where things are occurring and how severe some of this damage is. And one thing to note as well is that, these caterpillars, they feed on sugar maple and other hardwood species quite a bit, but they can be found all over the place. These are forest tent caterpillars just crawling up an emergency phone booth at Castleton State College many years ago. And sugar makers may see quite a bit of activity on their tubing. Anything really that's in the vicinity of these high population centers, these caterpillars will crawl on almost anything. And some things can actually be used as a conduit for travel, including tubing. So it's very common to see them on things other than trees as well. We get these high numbers, obviously, that are visible here during the outbreaks, but leading up to outbreaks, we want to have a tool at our disposal to be able to predict what's going to happen in future years or in the next year, more importantly. And one of those key tools that we use are pheromone traps to capture the moths. As Brittany mentioned, the moths are not really the destructive life stage of forest tent caterpillar for sugar maples, but it is the caterpillars themselves. But the moths do give us an indication of how much the population is building in a given stand. And so we use these kind of pheromone traps where there's a little bait at the top, and in the bottom of the cup that you see there on the screen, that little red rectangle is what's called a kill strip. And so the moths will be attracted to these traps, fly in, hit the bottom of the bucket, and that kills them. And by that way, we're able to determine moth numbers each year. And as those increase, we keep our eyes open and are listening to sugar makers and landowners in the areas to hear about if they're seeing caterpillars on the ground, and we can inform them with our trap catch to say that, yes, it does look like a population is building or not. So it's a really effective tool in prediction. And we have these scattered around the state to help us give a better sense of what might be happening in different corners of the forest. And some of the results that we wind up with look like this. You can kind of see the higher bars in each of these indicate obviously higher trap catch. And these are 4 different locations around the state that we've been tracking for decades now. We have, I can't remember the exact number we have out there now, somewhere around 15 sites now where we're trapping for forest tent caterpillar. And, we see these increases and decreases in population depending on the year. And they really coincide, obviously, with when we've had outbreaks. If you look at that top right image there of our Killington traps, you can see where there were high numbers in that 2004 to 2006 outbreak period, which coincided with the outbreak, of course. And then as you get towards the right side of the graph, you're seeing what was going on at our most recent outbreak, where populations in most of these traps, with the exception of Rochester, were increasing in that period. So we were on high alert for an outbreak that was impending. And so I'll share a few slides here of what we found from this most recent outbreak in terms of coverage, and kind of get into some of the work that we did and that the legacy of this most recent outbreak on sugar maples within the state. So contrary to the last outbreak map that I was showing from 2004 to 2006, the 2016 outbreak really started in the north central and northeast part of Vermont. The red polygons that you can see here in the map are those areas that we were able to map from aerial survey as being defoliated by FTC. And in that first year of the outbreak, we had around 25,000 acres of defoliation across the state. As we moved into the second year, that number increased, as did the geographic spread. So it still was primarily centered in north central and northeast Vermont, but you can see more and more polygons popping out along the spine of the Green Mountains and down into the southwest corner of the state, where we have the Taconic Mountains. And in that year, we had over 60,000 acres of defoliation present. And then in the third year of the outbreak, it really was mainly in the north central and northeast part of the state. Populations kind of started to die down a little bit in the southwest, but we had our highest total acres of defoliation in 2018, with over 70,000 acres of defoliation. So through the course of this outbreak, I think the total acreage that was defoliated was around 150,000 acres in the state of Vermont. When you look at those two different areas, from the old outbreak in 2004 to 2006 to the most recent one, you can certainly see that they're not in the same areas hardly at all. So this is, of course, a native pest. It can be present in low numbers every single year where sugar maples are present. And in this most recent outbreak, the conditions just were better suited for an outbreak in the north central and northeastern part of the state. One thing I guess I can point out there, I don't know if you can make it out on the screen that you have there in the classroom, but many of these areas, you can see those polygons do overlap in the north central and northeast part of the state. So there were multiple years of defoliation in a lot of these stands. And when you start having those multiple years of defoliation, that's when we had some sugar makers looking into some options for management that it did include spraying. Not everybody sprayed, and I'll get into some of the options that you might have, whether you decide to go that route or not. But when you do have multiple years of defoliation, you do increase the risk of damage to those trees, of course. So this has kind of been touched on a little bit, but just wanted to chat a little bit about how conditions get set up for population growth for forest ant caterpillars. So early warm springs can have a slight influence on FTC growth, as well as drought incidents. The 2016 outbreak in particular, we were kind of on the heels of a drought there. And part of the thinking there is that some of the natural controls that Brittany mentioned as well, the fungal species in particular, can be kind of hampered by reductions in moisture. So that can have a role in combating the growth that's present during an outbreak. Another thing that we found is something that can help set the stage for bigger impacts from FTC are stands of mostly sugar maple. So some of the sugar bushes that we have here in Vermont have been so heavily managed to sugar maple that the diversity of forest is not that great. And it's basically like a buffet for the FTC if you have a purely sugar maple dominated sugar bush. And in those cases, that's where we saw a lot of the heavier defoliation was in those pure sugar maple stands. And similarly, if stands have recently been thinned and had a lot of soil compaction or removed some of those non-sugar maple species, then you can have greater populations build as well. So those are a few things that can kind of help set the stage for an outbreak. And as was mentioned in the last talk too, that diversity in the sugar bushes is really an important factor in slowing down the success of FTC. So this is a quite an old picture, which is why it's black and white. But that's a red maple in the middle of a sugar bush stand, and you can see it's completely untouched, while those sugar maples surrounding it are completely denuded. So keeping a diverse forest is a really important tool to reducing the impacts of FTC. Things that can kind of cause collapse and that we've seen in Vermont, and I'll kind of go quickly through here since it's been touched on, but running out of a food source is one factor that can bring those populations down. Things like inclement weather. If you have that mismatch of FTC hatch with bud development, you might have that might be due to a warm spell in the spring, for instance, might leave some of those caterpillars without a food source, which would be beneficial to bringing the outbreak to a close. Predation could be a factor, and of course, disease and parasitism. And here you can see some of those caterpillars that are on tubing. All those are dead. And really the main reason for that particular image is because of fungal pathogens that can attack these caterpillars. Yeah, there was a good slide in Brittany's talk showing the impacts of one of those fungal pathogens. But you can see how the caterpillars just kind of hang straight down after they get this fungal pathogen. What we found in the most recent outbreak is when this hits, it can be pretty devastating to the population. And you might see, piles of dead caterpillars at the base of the tree. And so we received a lot of great photos and enthusiasm from sugar makers when they saw this happening in the last one, and we were equally pleased. So it does take time for this to happen. The population typically does need to build a little bit to see big impacts from the fungal pathogens, but they can really help bring these outbreaks to a close. And NPV was touched on as well. If you're interested in kind of differentiating between the virus and those fungal species, kind of the textbook thing to look for is if the caterpillars are hanging in like an upside down V shape, that's due to the virus, that again is associated with high population numbers. Those that are hanging just straight down, as you saw in the previous slide, are more likely impacted by the fungus, and especially if you see them kind of dried out and desiccated, that's a good indication that the fungus is taking hold as well. Parasitism, of course, is another thing that has an influence. That friendly fly is a little too friendly on somebody's toe there, but it was mentioned they might be a little bit of a nuisance and stick around, but they can certainly help bring some populations down a little later in the outbreak. And there are some egg parasites as well that will feed on FTC eggs. Sometimes it's not enough to really bring populations down in 1 year, but they can make a big impact as you get later into these outbreaks. So that last talk talked a lot about the impacts of defoliation on trees, which was excellent information. Just quickly reiterate some of that defoliation can reduce the carbohydrate production and storage in these trees and make trees more susceptible to stresses, can decrease the wood production, as you saw in those tree rings, can decrease the tap hole closure and create larger discoloration columns, decrease shoot growth. And I think one major factor that I like to impart on people is that, these things don't work in isolation, that these outbreaks happen and we're well familiar with them, but what's going on weather-wise and climatically can have a big impact. As I was talking about drought, that can really have an influence on the populations, but also on tree health. And so when you have these factors that combine, you oftentimes have greater stress on the trees than you would if it was just an outbreak. So being aware of environmental conditions and changing climatic factors can influence the health of your stand, but also might help you help influence your management strategies in combating an outbreak in your sugar bush. The role of a healthy forest was also touched on. And what I mean there is basically soil conditions and the base cation availability. So your calcium, your magnesium, There have been a few studies that have shown that if trees are growing on sites with higher calcium and magnesium, they might have some of these indicator species that are present in the stand as well, that those areas are more equipped to bounce back from defoliation. Indeed, in a study that was out of Pennsylvania quite a while back in the 90s, they were looking at those areas where there was low soil calcium and magnesium versus high. And those areas that had low calcium and magnesium indeed did have greater mortality of trees, regardless of the level of defoliation that they experienced. So maintaining good soil health is an important factor in having a good sugar bush in general, but as well in combating the effects of an outbreak such as this. So I want to touch on one thing that was kind of unique in our last outbreak was how trees were able to refoliate. Typically in these defoliation events by FTC, these trees are getting defoliated early enough in the season that they have a chance to refoliate, put out a new flush of leaves. That might look a little different, will likely be smaller, maybe a little more yellow or chlorotic. But most times you do see that these trees are able to put new leaves on the trees and continue to photosynthesize. In 2016, we had defoliation like this, and this is actually from Marcus Alhart as well, from a day we were out in the field together, where we saw, the defoliation in the trees here, and revisited the site a few weeks later and saw just a little bit of refoliation. This is not what you'd expect. This really small leaf size and not consistent refoliation on all limbs. And we think this is largely due to that drought that was leading up to this outbreak, that those trees were already stressed from the environmental conditions enough that they weren't able to put a new flush of leaves on. For the most part, these trees in subsequent years were able to put those leaves on, but this was certainly a setback for carbon gain within the trees and the ability to have a successful growing season. So although refoliation is typically expected, there are some instances where that's not going to be the case, and environmental conditions can kind of help you predict whether or not that's actually going to happen. So this is kind of what I just touched on, the legacy of the drought. That there was heavy seed, I forgot as well, in one of those years too, which further depleted some of the resources to be able to refoliate. We did test some of the buds as well and found some fungal species actually in some of the buds. So there were a number of things that were potentially impacting the tree's ability to refoliate. So something that we expect, but it's not something to take for granted, I suppose, in these FTC outbreaks. So I mentioned that we do a bunch of trapping to look for the population building within the state. This is a map just showing some of those areas where we do put those traps. And although we had a lot of good information from those traps leading into this most recent outbreak, those were from the sites with the blue triangles here. You can see that it doesn't really cover our entire state. And so we actually added a bunch of sites following this outbreak to better predict what's going to happen in other areas of the state with regard to FTC. So we are trapping quite a bit now for this insect. But the other tool that we touched on and that we'll touch on obviously at length tomorrow if you'll be at the field component of this workshop are egg mass surveys. And this is what you'll look like to all your friends out there while you're doing your egg mass surveys. But it's a great method for looking at what's actually on your trees in your sugar bush and being able to make an assessment of how severe defoliation could be in the coming years. So this is one tool. Binoculars are one tool you can use to look at those egg masses. Another tool is spotting scope, and we'll have both those available for use tomorrow. But basically what you're looking at are these branches in the trees, and you can see they look a little ragged there, and that's not bark sloughing off or anything like that. Those trees and those limbs there are just loaded with FTC egg masses. And again, we'll go through this in depth tomorrow, but I'll give you a few slides here of what to look for as you do some of these surveys. We've talked, I'll take any chance to use the word spumoline. So this is clearly a new egg mass encased in spumoline that has not hatched yet. So it looks very smooth. When you're looking at these twigs through binoculars and it's a sunny day, they reflect pretty well as well. So they're pretty shiny. So they do stick out. And that's quite a bit different than what you might see in some of the old egg masses. This is a image of an egg mass that's actually actively emerging, but you can see those open holes from where those caterpillars were able to hatch out of. And those will be a lot, they'll be a little more brown, less reflective, but differentiating between those two can take a little bit of training. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes tomorrow. With these surveys, we mentioned that there will be data sheets and the like out tomorrow, and that there are a number of methods to quantify the numbers of egg masses present in a stand and predict defoliation. But this is just one image of one type of survey that we've used in Vermont, where you do survey about 10 trees per point. And as Gabe was mentioning, we do have this method that we use occasionally where if you're unable to really differentiate between old versus new egg masses up in the canopy of the tree, you can find some of those twigs that might be nearby at eye level and kind of create a ratio of new to total egg masses and apply that ratio to the total number that you view through your spotting scope or the binoculars. And based on that number, after doing 10 trees, you have the ability to tell whether you're going to have defoliation being likely, whether there's a chance of defoliation, something that we call borderline, or no risk of defoliation. And again, we'll go through those various methods tomorrow. But just wanted to show you some of the work that came out of this last outbreak when we were involved with assisting on some of these surveys. I think we did over 65 surveys in the first year of this outbreak. And for the most part, most stands that we went in had no risk of defoliation. We had a smaller portion that were borderline and around 20 sites where we did predict defoliation. So, I think the one question that comes up with this kind of work where it's, slightly subjective in terms of whether or not you're going to miss an egg mass or two up in the canopy is how well does this kind of course evaluation actually predict defoliation? And in our experience, it's a really effective and rather precise tool. So this is a graph just showing the average number of egg masses on the x-axis there. So the further left you go, the fewer egg masses, and initial defoliation or early defoliation within the season on the y-axis there. And of course, the more egg masses that we had per 10 branches, the higher defoliation was in that initial stage. So it really is a good tool to use to know what's going to happen in your stand in a given year. So treatment's been brought up as well. And so we had some sugar makers that did decide to treat, and those that did decide to spray were very happy with the results. But not every sugar maker decided to treat. I want to put that out there, and I'll explain some of the considerations. This was, of course, aerial application. In 2017, there were over 3,000 acres treated by aircraft. And the chemical used is what was described earlier, this BTK chemical known as 4A48B. And at the time, and I believe it's still the case, this is a insecticide that is registered for organic use. So you can spray this and still maintain your organic certification if that is a concern for you. But I did want to touch on that, we have recommended to sugar makers that some options, if you don't want to spray, are to, of course, reduce your tapping. That's not palatable for some sugar makers if it is your main source of income, and I totally understand that. So if that's not an option, we did recommend that, if you're tapping, if you have more than one tap per tree in your sugar bush, maybe reducing that just by one tap can even make a difference in maintaining tree health down the road. So, and maintaining a diverse forest, as I talked about, of course, is another really important factor that could help you mitigate some of the impacts of FTC. But for those that are choosing to spray, one thing that you have to kind of figure out with your applicator is when's the best time to spray. And you do want to spray when those caterpillars are very small, but that there is still some leaf material there for that chemical to cling to and for those caterpillars to consume. And so we helped some folks out by creating just 4 monitoring plots within Vermont during the last outbreak to look at FTC hatch, so that we could convey that to sugar makers and the pesticide applicators to know when those caterpillars were hatching. And that was pretty effective. I think it was well received by the public, but more times than not, the sugar makers themselves were actually monitoring this phenology themselves and being in touch with those aerial applicators. So whether it was us or it was the individual landowners, monitoring that phenology was a really important step in knowing when to spray. And in our experience, at least, those applicators were kind of knew the general window when the caterpillars would be emerging and were ready to activate as soon as they heard that those caterpillars were on the move. So certainly something to consider if you're thinking about spraying. And I just kind of want to wrap up a little bit here by showing the effectiveness of these treatments. They are highly effective if you choose to go this route. So we assisted some sugar makers by going in and quantifying the initial defoliation. So this was early season, just when the caterpillars had emerged and leaves were out, and we could see that in some of these stands on average, there was a little over 15% defoliation. And recall that these caterpillars do have to eat some of the leaves, and some of the tree does have to be defoliated in order for the treatment to be effective. So some defoliation is expected. But you can see that there was not much of a jump after application in defoliation when you look at that change between initial and final defoliation here. So those treatments were highly effective. This is from 2017. 2018, we saw a similar trend where in the orange bar here are those stands where we had trees that were predicted to be defoliated, but they chose not to treat. And of course, there's greater defoliation in those stands compared to those where there were treatments that took place, which are the blue bars here. So they certainly can be very effective, is the point there. And finally, I'll leave you with this, is that mortality was brought up in the last couple of talks, that we, a few years after the initial defoliation event, flew to look for mortality within these areas that had been previously defoliated. And we did find some mortality in some of these stands, a total acreage of about 4,500 acres. And so we did see some mortality, obviously, in the state. But if you take that compared with the total acreage of defoliation, which, if you recall, was around 150,000 acres during the whole outbreak, it's by and large, most trees were able to recover from this outbreak and survive. And so just because your trees are defoliated in 1 year, or in some cases even 2 years, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have mortality on a stand-wide basis. So it is important, as I've tried to kind of harp on here a little bit, to pay attention to your particular site, pay attention to those environmental conditions, and hopefully those factors can help you make the right decision on whether to treat or not, and what other management options you might have. So I'll leave you with that. And if there, I don't know if I've got time for questions, but I'll be sticking around if there's not.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so there is one question in the chat from Clara. So she asks, when we observe signs of NPV or fungal pathogens, can we anticipate that the epidemic will conclude in the following year? My gut is to say it's not definitive. You can't guarantee that, but I think you would see populations reduce. But happy to hear your thoughts on that more, Josh.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'd say, Brittany, is it's a good indication, but some follow-up surveys with egg mass surveys, the winter after you see that activity of NPV or the fungus would really help you know for sure whether or not you're expecting defoliation the next year or not.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions. Oh, we have a live question. Go ahead.
Similar to browntail, is there any tree trimming as a preventative?
So the question was similar to browntail moth, is there any tree trimming?
From the egg masses, yeah.
So I would say no, just because there can be so many. There can be really hard to see, and on those trees that are really heavily swarmed with those egg masses. They're not necessarily on the tips of the branches in the same way that browntail is. When you're clipping browntail winter webs, they're, you're only really taking a small portion of the tree. Whereas these can really sometimes be all down a branch, and it would just become too tedious and too stressful for the tree to trim all of them. So I would say no. Really, it's just a survey method for those, and they're hard to destroy without taking the whole limb off. Yeah.
Yep, I totally agree with that.
Any other questions? Looks like Tyler in the chat has a question. Does the Maine Forest Service do forest tent caterpillar moth monitoring using spruce budworm traps? That might be a question, answer for Gabe.
Yeah, we do not currently do that. Our monitoring efforts for forest tent right now are based purely on forest tent and then site visits. We could potentially incorporate something in the future, but it is a lot of effort to go through if we're only having these outbreaks every, 8 to 10 years.
Hopefully that
Yeah.
was loud enough so folks could hear the answer from Gabe. We also have our other Maine Forest Service entomologist Mike answering in the chat as well.
Yeah, I would also just point out that we have our light trapping program, which has traps spread throughout the state. We do collect forest tent caterpillar adults every year in that.
Yeah.
We had one more question from Clara.
Oh, yes. So Clara has one more question here. Do you think that reducing tapping has a significant impact on the survival of trees that are defoliated? Is that proven with data?
It's yeah, it's that is a really good question. We've seen that reducing the tapping can assist with greater carbohydrate storage. We've done some root sampling in the past to look at the impacts of carbohydrate depletion from this kind of outbreak. And it certainly can have an impact on that storage factor. Mortality is a good question. I don't know if I have seen data that are showing that pulling taps is going to save more trees in an outbreak, since we don't have such widespread mortality with this insect that we do with some others. But it is a good question. I'd have to refer to my counterparts at the Proctor Maple Research Center here in Vermont to get maybe a little more info on that. Good question.
All right. Seeing no other questions in the chat, we can move on here with Kyle Lombard from New Hampshire. So Kyle, I will go ahead and give you the floor here. And thanks again, Josh, for your presentation.
All righty. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. I do recognize that I'm last, so I knew that, and hopefully I'm going to be not repeating too much. I'm going to show you some stuff in New Hampshire that might be a little bit different or unique. If I can figure out how to share my screen. Just trying one more thing. So, all right, let's just move on. Let's just leave it in this presenter mode.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I think I can make my points without needing the whole real estate of the screen.
right.
So
Floor is
we
yours.
had 2 outbreaks in New Hampshire in the last 20 years. One was in 2004 and one was in 2016. You've heard this story already. And so you can see the first outbreak in 2004 for us was the lower black star in central western New Hampshire. The latest outbreak starting in 2016 was in the North Country. The differences, interestingly, was that the southern outbreak was in mostly oak and some sugar maple, and then the one in the North Country was completely 100% sugar maple. And you can see so both of them presented in the same ways. They started out the first year with around 10,000 acres, quickly bumped up to 60,000 acres, and then quickly dissipated in 2 or 3 years down to nothing again. So like the latest one was 9,000 in 2016, 20,000, back down to 8,000, down to 2,000, and back down to 0 by 2020. So they come and go pretty quickly. And this is just another slide of what it looks like from mapping. Those red polygons were the first 2005 outbreak, and then the outbreak in the North Country was up around Northumberland, Kilkenny, high elevation sugar maple, and high elevation sugar bushes were what got hit in the North Country. You've already seen some of this, egg masses for forest 10. This is just a neat slide, and then it shows the difference between forest 10 and eastern 10. The eastern 10's on the right, and the egg masses are slightly different. So this is just something people have already gone over. The pupation sites are in the understory of the trees that didn't get defoliated. This is the North Country outbreak from 2015-ish to 2020. You can see that the band of defoliation starts around 1,800, 2,000 foot elevation, goes all the way up to 3,000. And this is just more shots from the airplane of the defoliation in July. This is what it looked like on the ground. Both of these last two outbreaks in New Hampshire were pretty much controlled by the same thing, we think. The friendly fly, or the government fly, as some people like to call it, really builds quickly the population, and it really just gets pretty crazy in some of these infested areas. The fly really does a good job, but we also did have a lot of NPV kill in our sugar bushes. You've seen slides like that already. One thing we do in New Hampshire is that we offer both egg mass counts to our landowners and starch testing to Sugarbush folks. And this hasn't been talked about yet, but starch testing, we think, in New Hampshire is a valuable tool. So the gist of it is that you can sort of measure the vigor and health of the sugar maple trees by taking root samples, staining them with an iodine concoction, and the darker the stain, the healthier the tree. And so this is just a slide showing you that a sugar maple tree with very low starch reserves in the roots doesn't turn color. It pretty much doesn't even stain. Versus the lower chips that have lots of starch in the roots, and they respond to the iodine staining and turn black. This slide is from the 2005 outbreak in western central New Hampshire, where we did quite a bit of root starch testing in sugar bushes that got hit. And this is just to show you that the left blue bar is non-defoliated, non-tapped. That was our control trees. Center defoliated, no tapping. And then the far right bars were defoliated with tapping. And you can see high starch, moderate starch, low starch, and depleted starch in the roots. So as you see more defoliation and more tapping, you start shifting to more trees that are low and depleted in starch. And so that's information that if a sugar bush came to us, we would do this for them, and if they were considering adjusting their tapping. So yeah, this is just an example of a site in the North Country that we actually did do some starch testing. This 23.5 is the plot number. So the tree that this upper chip is from a tapped tree, and the chip in the lower is the control. C is the control. So plot number 23.5, the control that wasn't tapped, had lots of starch reserves in the roots compared to the tap tree. This is just a a satellite image where we overlaid the plot locations onto the imagery, and then put little pictures of the chips, the stained chips onto the overlay. So you can get a sense where on the landscape trees tended to be more vigorous versus less vigorous. And this is just all of the plot chips stacked up. So you can see low elevation to high elevation. All the high elevation, the trees were struggling pretty good. Some of the lower elevations still look pretty good. Trees were still fairly healthy. Recommendations for timber management. Doesn't sound like we need to do too much chatting about that. In New Hampshire, we did just recommend that people try not to harvest until 2 years after the outbreak, just because you don't need to add any more stress to a stressed out stand with soil compaction and root damage. And the predators and parasites do a lot better in closed canopies. So the more you thin your stand out, those funguses and viruses and friendly flies and all the other things that are going to attack do less well in thinned out stands. They prefer closed canopy. But here was our recommendations for sugarbush operators. So it boils down to we do support people spraying in New Hampshire, and we would help them. We would do the egg mass counts for them if they were considering spraying. We generally wanted to remind people what the pitfalls of spraying pesticides are. And so in New Hampshire, spraying BT is tricky business because it has to be ingested. And forest tent caterpillar emerges over such a wide time frame in the spring that it's hard to get complete control. And so it's only, you've heard Josh say it's only effective on small larvae. And there's already a large suite of native predators and pathogens that build quickly. So in New Hampshire, we didn't have anybody that went and decided to actually spray. And then lastly, we did offer root starch testing in the second and third year of any outbreak. All right, that was my last slide. So I can take questions, maybe, if I can figure out how to stop sharing. All right. I think I'm back.
Kyle, how time consuming is the root starch like sample collection and testing?
Yeah, so we did all of the root starch testing in our lab, but the caveat is that we asked the Sugarbush operators to bring us the samples. And so that's the doing the sampling in the field is what takes the time, because you have to find a 1/2-inch diameter root before the ground freezes, yet after leaf off. So there's a time window that you need to do it in November, December, where and then they have to be frozen. The samples need to be left frozen until they come to us. We thaw them out and do the sampling and do the iodine testing. So depending on how many you do, it can be a day's worth of work out in the Sugarbush.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Does the Forest Service have the facilities or tools to run that for folks?
I volunteer,
Sorry,
Allison.
we were
happy
having.
to do them.
Can you guys hear us?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, we were having some issues with our bottle. But Gabe, go
Yeah,
ahead.
it's not something that we've done in the past. It sounds like what Kyle's mentioned, it's fairly straightforward if you have the samples on hand. I don't know, it's something that we can discuss.
Yeah, for one, I'm not super familiar with starch testing before, so it's pretty cool. First time hearing of it.
Yeah, but just going to Mike's question below, is there like a color match sheet to determine the exact starch level that you can just reference? Is that the way it works?
Yes, it is. We use the protocols that were developed out of New York. And so we use their recipes for the iodine, and we use their color charts. And so it's a visual color match by species.
I will have to dive into the literature some more, but I do know that this root starch testing is something that Proctor Maple Research Center leans on a lot. So there definitely is some important correlation to at least tree health and sugaring operations with that test.
So I might have missed it, but Tyler in the chat had asked what time of year the root starch testing samples are taken. I'm not sure if we addressed that yet.
Yeah, we were chatting about that, I think,
Okay.
during communication issues. So you've got there's a window of opportunity to do this. It has to be after leaf off and before frozen ground. So
Okay.
so you've got November, December basically to get it done, and you've got to sample, 1/2 to 1 inch diameter roots, and then they have to be frozen as soon as possible to bring to the lab as cold and frozen as possible. So they will, temperature is going to degrade that starch and sugar. So it's really important to sort of collect and get it to the people that are going to do the starch testing pretty quickly.
I am still seeing some other questions in the chat, but they are more broad. They're not super related to Kyle. So I think we can just jump right into the discussion, the Q&A with the panelists. As I understand it, I think everyone's microphones and cameras are off and muted. So you want to just throw some questions into the chat, we can get a discussion sort of brewing here, but I'll go ahead and start with the questions that haven't been addressed yet. So one of these is from Trevor. He asks, how far outside the 2024 defoliated area do you suggest collecting egg mass surveys?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I've got a blanket answer for it. I think it kind of depends on, it depends on the type of forest you got. Is it contiguous sugar maple out there, or do you have gaps in there? As you've seen from some of the maps that have been put up there, you can have pretty disparate areas within states that are having coordinated FTC outbreaks going on. So, we tend to put that in the hands of landowners, that if you're concerned about your sugarbush being part of this outbreak, then go ahead and do some surveys. It's not that time intensive to get out there and assess that kind of thing. So, we have our kind of our long-term areas where we monitor for the moths as well, where we're looking for egg masses as well. But I think it really, from our perspective and our experience, at least, it's based on landowners. Just because you're not in a polygon of previous defoliation doesn't mean that you're not going to get defoliated the next year. So if you're concerned, I'd say sample.
Yep, that makes sense to me. Trevor also asks that he is curious if there are long-term studies comparing BTK treated and untreated bushes. I don't think I have on that. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I don't know about long-term. Yeah.
And Clara asks, what is normally the protocol used for spraying? What concentration of BTK and how many applications?
Really, when we were working with applicators, it's what's on the label, and that's what they follow. So I don't have those details in front of me here, but the broader protocol for how we've had landowners work with applicators in the past is that the landowner has to develop a polygon or a shape file that's what's known as the spray block. And here in Vermont, at least, they have to identify those areas where there might be, wells that are present, open water, that sort of thing, and create buffers around those areas to ensure that those don't get hit with the spray as well. Submitting that file to the applicator, they use that for their spray. And here in Vermont, at least, the applications were just happening once per season. There were some folks that decided to treat multiple years. I think there was less than 5 that decided to do that, but just one application per growing season here.
Thanks, Josh. We also
Um,
have Alex Peacock on this chat as well. He's from the Board of Pesticides Control for the state of Maine. Alex, if you are present, I just changed you in presenter, so if you have anything to add, feel free to jump in here as well.
Yeah, no, thank you, Brittany. Yeah, as it comes to aerial applications, clearly, yes. I mean, we want to make sure that any of the applicators, as you had mentioned before, are properly licensed to apply here in the state of Maine, have the proper forestry categories, and that there's also specific notification requirements for forestry aerial applications here in the state of Maine. And as has been touched on, is properly registered products, including 4A, 48B, and it's the onus is on the applicator to follow the label, as I think everybody should be aware, and that they as far as quantities applied per acre, that will all be dictated by the label. And we would certainly can provide any guidance or any label interpretation for folks going forward, as well as seeking out alternatives. I will do want to mention between forest tent caterpillar pressures and spruce budworm pressures as well. My understanding is many of the BT products may be hard to come by. So if you're planning for next season and you believe you have populations that are going to need to be applied, that you may want to be checking on the availability of those products now, especially as it was even mentioned that they do have a shelf life. And not only do they not persist long in the environment, but as well as they do not persist long on the shelf as well. So I'm happy to help any coordination and provide additional information as the notification protocols and such are necessary here in Maine.
Kind of somewhat thinking about that shelf life, but also just general management and efficacy. Joshua, are you familiar with many landowners who had an applicator lined up, but then because of the phenology and just the timing of everything, and then weather events, they weren't able to get it done?
I think we were pretty lucky in the last outbreak that we didn't have any of those cases. I think the only times where we had somebody who had planned on treatment not treat was the landowner decided at the last minute that they just didn't want to incur the cost and backed out of it.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question in the classroom.
Hi, I'm really interested in the distribution of those kind of pockets. I was wondering about the flight range of the moths and if you think that has something to do with the way these patches are so disparate, or if you think that patches are maybe more continuous and it's just really low populations that we're not able to protect or, detect or something like that.
Do you mean the patches in like the current outbreak in Big Six that you're looking at, or
Any outbreak?
Yeah, I can't recall the distance that they can fly. Gabe or Brittany, do you remember the mileage that they can?
I don't know off the top of my head. I mean, since they are a native species, I would assume that they're pretty much omnipresent anywhere where their host is available. In terms of flight range, we would be just talking about the quantity that would move from one area to the next. Looking at the outbreak in northern Aristic, it looks like it's pretty much tracking with the host species. And it spreads, you could see on the maps how far it spreads year after year. That's what I would assume its flight range is dependent on.
Yeah.
Was there something more to that question? I can't remember.
I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll also just point out the technical manual that Allison just posted. It's made by Valent, the producer of Foray. It's an excellent manual. It's very comprehensive. If you're taking that spraying, definitely check it out.
Yeah, and I think any questions regarding concentrations or pesticide products would probably be best be answered by aerial pesticide applicators. They likely would have access to that product and would know the kinds of concentrations required for that area. So.
And it might change based on their equipment, and they've got everything calibrated in. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Were there any other questions for any of the panelists here today? I think I got all of them in the chat. Alrighty, well, seeing nothing, looks like Alex just put in some more information about aerial pesticide. So that can be found on the Maine Board of Pesticides Control website if you're spraying in the state of Maine. But I'm not seeing anything else, so I think I'll just give you your 20 minutes back. We are available by email. If you have any other questions, I can certainly pass that along to any of the panelists here today. I want to thank you again for attending. And for those folks who are going into Big Six for some egg mass practice for us tomorrow, happy to see you there. Please reach out if you have any questions on all of my emails. I've got the email and my cell phone as well. So if you need to text me or anything like that regarding how to get there or anything really, just let me know. Thanks again. Thank you to Jason and Kyle and Joshua and Gabe. With that, I think we're all sit here. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Brett.
Everyone.
Thanks for having me.